Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those within the community, as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Welcome to Insights. I'm Sherry Stewart. This week we're taking a look at bipartisan legislation that's made its way to the governor's desk. If signed, Michigan will have the most expansive expungement package in the nation. The bill is known as clean slate legislation. And joining me to talk about that today is John Cooper. He is Executive Director of Safe and Just Michigan. But before we hear from him, we want to introduce you to Hakeem Crampton. He is also a social justice advocate. Well, Mr. Crampton, I want to thank you for spending time with us today on Insights. You are an award-winning poet and author of 8 books. You have received a dozen awards of community service, and there are a whole lot of other accolades on your bio. But before that, you were staring down the hall, if you will, of a 45-year prison sentence. So walk us through that.
Absolutely. I was a young kid raised in Michigan that got swept into the crack cocaine era, found myself in and out of juvenile and jail, relocated to Milwaukee, Wisconsin to start fresh, enrolled in Job Corps, got in a fight at a liquor store as an 18-year-old kid, still not having my full mind together. And I got in a fight at a liquor store and got in custody, and then was questioned by detectives about an unsolved murder that happened literally 3 weeks before. And in that interrogation, questioning myself and 2 of my friends, the detectives began to tell us that each of us had confessed to this particular crime, that none of us had any involvement in. Long story short, one of us confessed, Mark Henry. He was 19. He confessed to the murder, went to trial off his testimony. We were found guilty off his testimony. I was sentenced to 45 years in prison. And it was at that moment that I really had to come to grips with my life and how I got to the condition that I was in to find myself incarcerated. It wasn't unlikely for me to be incarcerated at that time in my life, but to be wrongly incarcerated was to me to be unlikely. And so it was there that I focused on developing and turning into a man and growing and figuring out how I was going to navigate this life I was now in to come out better on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you, I understand that the Wisconsin Innocence Project were the advocates in your case, and they are the ones that fought for your release. So walk us through that. How did you make that connection, and how were they able to do this?
In late 90s, there was a lot of generated media in my case, mid to late 90s. And an organization in Paterson, New Jersey called Centurion Ministries, they heard about my case, picked it up, handed it off to the Association Defense of the Wrongly Convicted that was head up by Reuben Hurricane Carter, who had been wrongly convicted himself, spent many years in prison, over 2 decades, and Denzel Washington played his life in a movie called Hurricane. That organization picked up my case and asked the Wisconsin Innocence Project to take a look at my case. Wisconsin Innocence Project took an earlier look at my case, but said I hadn't been locked up long enough, and they needed to focus on people who had been locked up longer. So when they got the recommendation from the Association of Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, they took my case and they began preparing to fight to get me released. After about 3 years of having my case, we were able to actually have a meeting with the Wisconsin parole chairman, whom they were able to then convince that I was worthy of being released, not only based on my innocence, but the great accomplishments that I had done with my life while I was incarcerated. And so the Wisconsin parole chairman, Mr. Leonard Wells, agreed with them and agreed that I had never should have been arrested or convicted, and that he was granting me a parole.
And so, I mean, we know that there are many other stories that are similar to yours in terms of arrests and convictions. And so, as we're talking today about this clean slate legislation that is before the governor for signature, how important is this legislation for people that have been incarcerated and then they re-enter society and they're working to rebuild their lives?
It's critically important. It's actually almost as critically important as life or death. You have to understand that if a person in society commits a crime and that person then pays their debt to society for that crime, we as a society, we have an obligation to be supportive of that individual to make sure that that individual has the kind of support they need to be able to provide for themselves and their family. Because if we as a society fail to support them in that transition phase, then we are setting ourselves up for more issues within our community, because people who have criminal histories and are unable to get employed, unable to get housing, unable to access education, unable to access affordable health care, these are individuals that are then locked out of society. And if those individuals then have to re-offend to survive, maybe sell drugs, maybe rob a bank, if they have to do that for survival means, then we as a society have failed in that justice system to create the kind of real proper safety and discipline and punishment that is really needed to create a safe society for people, right? And so it's critically important that people coming home from prison get supported and have the opportunity to have their felony expungement, their felonies put to the side so that they can move forward in life.
And then just taking a step back, so inside the penal system, was it your experience that there were rehabilitative programs? You were a young kid, essentially, when you were incarcerated for that time. What type of support is, and I would imagine every system is different, but just generally speaking, what type of support is available for the incarcerated? We do understand that some can pursue educational options. So exactly what is available, or what actually happens?
Sadly, Department of Corrections across the country, they fail to understand that rehabilitation isn't just about a person coming into the system and needing a GED, needing counseling and support, needing anger management. That in itself is not a rehabilitative process or method to work with an individual who comes from traumatic communities, violent-ridden communities, communities of poverty, communities that have been structured based upon systems of systematic racism that have created conditions in communities for poverty to exist, for wanton poverty, for young children to ultimately want to go out and sell drugs and find themselves in the penological system. When a kid comes in the system like that, he doesn't need just a GED or counseling therapy. He needs to have a real reckoning with his condition, his community and social condition, how he or she came to the condition that they are in. So it needs to be a mental and emotional reawakening in that child. And the DLC just isn't set up to do that. So therefore it requires outside programs, interventions from directly impacted programs and organizations to actually get involved with the rehabilitation process. Because what happens is somebody come in prison with a 20-year sentence and the DOC says, you have 20 years. At this time, the DOC has no interest in rehabilitating you yet, because right now you have to do time. And at the back end, when you're getting ready to get released, they say, okay, you're getting ready to get released. Now we need to get you ready for release. Well, see, 12, 13, 14 years could have went by in which that individual could have gotten lost emotionally and mentally through the trauma of incarceration, through the trauma of isolation and segregation, right? And so therefore, we're missing a key element when it comes to rehabilitation.
And in the time we have remaining, talk a little bit about some of the programs that you have established for youth to try to address that. So you have, you're the founding director of Amen for Youth. You have a pedagogy program that you are able to deliver into schools. So talk a little bit about that in the time we have left.
Absolutely. Slam lyrical education is a very rigorous, unique approach to mentoring with young people in schools. We know that hip hop has a very powerful effect on children's lives. It's not really hip hop, it's music, right? It's music. And so using the written structures of writing, sonnets and lyrics, right, through English, I was able to create a curriculum that is very engaging in the classroom. So I come in the classroom, work with teachers, train teachers how to use my curriculum for grades 4 through 12. And it's a very engaging curriculum that allows students to be able to take their classroom coursework and to regurgitate it in a poetic form, in a spoken word form, in a lyrical form, in a song form that meets the same academic standards that the teacher needs the student to know. If they needed to know something about civics, they need to know some dates, some names, and some places and events. They're able to then take that chapter through my curriculum. They're able to then learn how to write lyrics, and then they can then perform it in the classroom for a grade. I have impacted literally hundreds and hundreds of classrooms, thousands of students across the state of Michigan with this curriculum. Teachers love it and swear by it. And the problem is that the education system isn't really ready for this type of of intervention because I'm a formerly incarcerated person. I come into the school system with a criminal record, with the curriculum, don't have a background in education, a master's degree, et cetera. So oftentimes the schools try to shun me from coming into the systems. And see, it's that blocking for people like me that the expungement process would remove those barriers and allow me to continue working in school as an education consultant.
Understood. Well, we're out of time. We want to leave it there, Mr. Crampton. So I want to thank you for sharing your story with us today. In just a couple of minutes, we'll be speaking with John Cooper, who I know that you know from the Safe and Just Michigan program.
Absolutely. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Insights will return after these messages.
Well, joining me now is John Cooper. He is the Executive Director of Safe and Just Michigan. And I want to thank you for joining me today.
Of course, it's great to be here.
And you are an attorney, Mr. Cooper, correct?
Yeah, my background is as a criminal defense lawyer. I'm not practicing anymore because I do policy work.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right into this legislation, clean slate legislation, as we know that it's called. Earlier, we were just having a conversation with Hakeem Crampton, who explained the importance of this legislation, the pending legislation, and how it would change lives. So can you walk us through, I guess, the journey to getting this to the governor's desk?
Absolutely. And I want to sort of start by stepping back into the big picture. So I think it's not well known publicly, but about 30% of adults have some kind of a criminal record. And these, unless these records are sealed by a court order, they just stay out there publicly for landlords and employers to see regardless of how old they are. So we in Michigan have a process where a person can file a petition in court to seal an old criminal record, but it's not a process that is very easy to navigate for people. So we have over 3 million people in our criminal history database in Michigan. Our state population is about 10 million, but 2,000 to 3,000 people a year are able to successfully navigate the petition process. So we have a lot of people who just have criminal records. They haven't gotten into trouble in a very long time, but they continue to live under the weight of that criminal history, and it keeps people out of employment or underemployed. And it also restricts housing options because most housing options in the rental market are held privately. Many landlords do background checks. Colleges do background checks. So if you look at all the different ways a person can gain social mobility, all of those different pathways are limited by an old conviction. Mm-hmm. So what we tried to do with the Clean Slate campaign was look at what are the barriers people are facing. Why are so few people successfully navigating the expungement process? And what we learned was most people either don't know about it, don't qualify for it because the standards are very narrow, or simply cannot complete the petition process the way it's laid out. You know, because courts are only open during the workday, if you have a job, you can't skip your job to go to court. You know, the records offices that you need to go to get your official record, those are only open during the workday. And if you've moved from the place where you were convicted, you have to go to the original place of conviction. It's hard to get records online. You have to go back to court several times for a hearing process. Mm-hmm. So what you have is a lot of structural barriers to getting a record sealed. And we got some great research from the University of Michigan Law School last spring that really illustrates why this is a valuable process, why we should want more people to be able to get their records sealed. And what they found was studying historical data from the Michigan State Police and from the Unemployment Insurance Agency and the State Tax Department, is they looked at people who have gotten their records sealed historically over a 10-year period. Mm-hmm. And they said, okay, what happens to those people's income and employment prospects? And what they learned was within the first year of getting a criminal record sealed, a person's personal income goes up by 23%. And they're 11% more likely to be employed in the first place. So like those are big impacts on a person's life. And there are so many hundreds of thousands of people in the state of Michigan that have been unable to realize those impacts because they have not been able to seal their records. And the other great thing that this study did, because you know, people understandably are concerned, if we seal records, are we hiding information that would be useful to the public?
Right.
So what this study found was for people who have gone 5 years without committing a crime, and that's the current waiting period for expungement petitions in Michigan.
Okay.
For that group of people, they are no more likely than a member of the general public to receive a subsequent conviction. So when you're looking at people who stayed out of trouble for 7 or 10 years, which are the waiting periods for the automatic expungement, those groups of people are very unlikely to commit another crime, and keeping their records public actually distorts the labor market and the housing market by signaling to landlords and employers that these people are dangerous and likely to commit another crime when in fact they're not.
You're saying 30% of the population, the general population, has something that will cause some type of delay in terms of their social mobility.
That's right. It's a very widespread problem, not just in Michigan, but nationally. But, we in Michigan reflect these national trends where you just have a lot of people coming in and out of the criminal justice system for one thing or another. One of the really big issues we see in Michigan is actually traffic offenses. So traffic cases constitute half of all criminal cases that come through our courts. Many of them are regulatory violations. So, if you've gotten a driver's license suspended because you didn't pay a parking ticket, that's driving with a suspended license, that's a misdemeanor. Driving without insurance or without your license in the car with you. Those kinds of violations are very, very common, and they show up on people's records. And until this bill package was passed, no traffic offense of any kind was eligible to be sealed from a person's record. So there's the majority of people who are eligible for this, we believe, are likely dealing with primarily or exclusively traffic offenses, just because they constitute such a large part of the overall criminal history database, and because they haven't been expungible in the past.
So, John, I understand that this is bipartisan legislation. So explain to us the process of the heavy lifting to actually get this to the governor's desk.
Sure. So it's been almost 2 years in the making. We started the campaign at the start of last session in January 2019. And the first stage of it really was just getting as many stakeholders engaged in the process as possible. So business groups, conservative groups, faith-based groups, impacted people. And we all sort of came together and acknowledged that criminal record sealing is a problem that needs to be worked on. And the support of the business community in particular was really important, because obviously businesses are among the stakeholders that are most affected by criminal record sealing. And, we were proud to have the support of everyone from the Small Business Association to the Detroit Regional Chamber of Commerce, Grand Rapids Chamber, Lansing, Saginaw. And that was really helpful, particularly with the Republican legislature. So a lot of work went into the sort of ins and outs of the bills, the specific details, and, all stakeholders had an opportunity to weigh in. We, of course, pressed for broader legislation, and we lost some battles around various issues. But ultimately, Chairman Filler in the House, he's the chair of the Judiciary Committee there, and his minority vice chair, David LeGrand, who's a Democrat, they worked together really productively to move these bills forward in the House. They passed out of the House in November of last year. And then since then, it's been working on senators addressing concerns. There was, of course, a pause in the legislation when the pandemic hit. But thankfully, folks returned to work and made it a priority to keep these bills moving. But it really was a bipartisan effort. My understanding is the governor's office is supportive. So, it's actually another example in a long line of criminal justice reforms that have been bipartisan. And I think that's really important. Historically, criminal justice hasn't necessarily been a bipartisan priority. And we don't have a lot of bipartisan priorities these days. So, on something as important as criminal justice, it's really heartwarming to see.
Yeah. And,
the votes were big. I think the automatic expungement bill was 93-12 in the House. I think it was 28-9 in the Senate. So those are big margins. And bipartisan majorities.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to point out, that bipartisan collaborative effort was so important to point out. John, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more insights to talk about what exactly is in the legislation.
Insights will return after these messages.
Welcome back to Insights. We're continuing our conversation with John Cooper. He is the Executive Director of Safe and Just Michigan, and we are talking about clean slate legislation, which is currently on the governor's desk awaiting her signature. And everyone believes that's been a part of this effort, this at least 2-year effort, believes that this would be legislation that would be signed by the governor. So John, walk us through what exactly is in the clean slate legislation as it's become known. I believe you said earlier that if you not had an offense for 7 to 10 years, that you would qualify under this. So walk us through that.
Sure, yeah. So there's 2 main components to the bill package. The first one is the automatic expungement.
Okay.
So this is for a certain subset of convictions. No assaultive or violent convictions, no sex offenses are eligible for record sealing under this provision. But for lower level convictions, this says if you've stayed out of trouble for 7 years and you have a misdemeanor on your record, that misdemeanor is eligible to be sealed. And if you have a non-violent lower level felony, that can be sealed after 10 years. And this is the bill in the package that is the most innovative. It's the one that sets a new standard nationally for record clearing. There have been automatic expungement bills passed in Pennsylvania, Utah, a couple other places, but they've only ever applied to low-level misdemeanors, and they've been limited in some other ways. So this is a really important reform from our perspective. It doesn't require people to go to court and apply. It just says, if you've stayed out of trouble for 7 or 10 years and you have a low-level conviction, we're just going to seal that as a matter of public policy. Mm-hmm. The other piece of the legislation is, it's 6 other bills actually, but they're all around eligibility to petition. Mm-hmm. So we have this existing petition process. It's quite narrow. You cannot apply for it if you have more than 1 felony on your record or more than 2 misdemeanors. So there's a variety of ways in which the bills expand that. So first, it creates an opportunity for people to apply to have more than 1 felony sealed or more than 2 misdemeanors. There's an expansion of eligibility there. There's a bill related to that says if you get multiple charges out of a single act, it's very common. Mm-hmm. For example, if someone gets arrested for a drug possession, it's oftentimes going to lead to multiple charges, conspiracy to distribute drugs, perhaps gun possession. So a lot of people will have been arrested once, but they'll have gotten multiple charges out of that arrest. And even 20 or 30 years later, they can't get it off their record because it falls outside the scope of the existing statute. So it's just a really significant thing for a lot of people. And, we're really hopeful that it's going to spur economic productivity in a lot of places. I mean, there's been challenges for employers in Metro Detroit to get folks to do construction work because of problems finding people without records. There's been a worker shortage in West Michigan for a long time, particularly in manufacturing and building trades. So, that's a big part of why employers supported this is, that it frees up more qualified workers to help build our economy.
Surely. Well, can you explain for us what exactly is considered low-level offenses, though, under this, or just generally? What are you looking at when you say low-level offenses?
Yeah, so there's a definition in the bill. So in the automatic expungement bill, it allows misdemeanors that are not considered serious, and that's a statutory term. So something like domestic violence or child abuse, not eligible. Drunk driving is not eligible. Reckless driving is not eligible. If there's restrictions on the felony, so if a felony is punishable by more than 10 years in prison, it's not eligible.
Not eligible under this. Mm-hmm.
That's right, yeah. And, in Michigan, we have what's called indeterminate sentencing. So a lot of crimes have a relatively high maximum. Mm-hmm. So you'll see someone get, 2 to 10 years. if it's something where a person could get more than a 10-year sentence, it's just not going to be eligible.
Sure.
That was a compromise that was worked out among the stakeholders. I think legislators wanted to be cautious with some aspects of the automatic expungement, just understanding this is a new thing.
Yeah. Now, for Northeast Michigan specifically, which is where most of our viewers are coming from, is there any feedback or any research on how this would impact this particular region?
Yeah, I mean, we expect to see proportionally some of the same impacts as Metro Detroit. It's probably going to be even more skewed towards traffic because that is where a lot of people in Northeast Michigan encounter law enforcement is on the roads. One issue that came up during the legislative process that I think is worth flagging, we and others advocated for DUI convictions to be eligible for expungement after a set number of years, and currently drunk driving is not eligible. And we believe there will be an effort to add first offense drunk driving to the list of eligible offenses, but that's going to proceed separately because drunk driving is a major concern for law enforcement. There are thousands of drunk driving cases every year. So I think the bill sponsors didn't want to take that on as part of the larger package because they wanted the issue to sort of be dealt with on its own 2 feet. So I certainly support making old drunk driving convictions eligible. The most important thing to understand is that if a person has stayed out of trouble for 5, 7, 10 years, they're just not very likely to get into trouble again. There's really strong research on that. So the key is really having a waiting period.
Understood. Well, John, and the time that we have remaining, can you let us know once the governor has signed it? Obviously your team is believing that she will sign this bill. What is the next step? Does this bill become effective immediately? Are we looking at sometime in 2021? What is the next step?
Yeah, so that's a great question and really important. And we've been getting a lot of questions about that from members of the public. So the bills as drafted related to the petition process have an effective date that runs 180 days from signature. So we're looking at April of 2021 for the effective date of those bills. I believe it's extended out in order to allow the local courts to prepare for an influx of petitions, because we do expect that more people will apply now that there are more people that are eligible. The automatic expungement has a 2-year implementation period, and there's also a contingency on that period running for funding to build out the computer system necessary to implement it. We anticipate that funding will get done fairly soon, but it's on a separate track from the policy bills. So we're looking at probably late 22 for the automatic expungement. Although if it was ready to roll out, if it's been tested and it's all ready to go before then, the governor's office could, if it wanted to, start clearing records soon. And we'd certainly advocate for that. But the agencies involved do have to build a new system, and interface between the courts and the state police database. So there are some things that need to be done in order to make it happen. And a lot of the behind the scenes work on the legislation was actually talking to technical experts who can help game out how the system will work, help write the computer program that will implement it, and getting legislators and the agencies comfortable with the fact that this is doable and doable at not a huge cost was an important background factor in the campaign.
Absolutely. Well, John, we want to thank you for spending time with us today to explain the clean slate legislation that looks like it will be signed, I guess, very soon by the governor. So again, we want to thank you today for educating us on this.
Hey, happy to. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, that does it for this week's Insights. If you have a question, comment, or story idea, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at news@wbkb11.com. I'm Sherry Stewart. Thank you again for watching.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.